because I'd rather say that I'm quite disappointed with your presentation today, because I've always been a huge fan of your initial presentations when you talk about the region. I mean, my rather concern is taking up some numbers, to quoting some kind of quantitative data, and then making that particular analysis, which is, in my opinion, a little rather simplistic. Because if we have to look into Pakistan, the region in itself, I mean, look at Sri Lanka, look at Bangladesh, look at India, look at Pakistan. I mean, all these countries have had their own kind of like challenges vis-a-vis terrorism, vis-a-vis dealing with possibly dealing with minority issues. So I would rather, I mean, I would expect a bit more sophisticated argument coming out of it. Do you see? Is this an ongoing debate that you're going to be looking into? Thank you.
Kiran Hassan is questioning whether using numbers is a too simplistic way of recording the intensity of communal violence and the like. And she's asking whether this is an ongoing research, or whether this is, I mean, whether you likely to see sort of changes in the numbers which are going to explain something about it.
All right, so I'm going to turn to civilian government, because I'm really glad that this person asked this question. In the United States in particular, again, there's this myth that there's two Pakistans. There's the civilian Pakistan and there's the military Pakistan. And if one day the civilians could just truly be in charge, then Pakistan could be different. I argue in my book that that's unlikely, because the strategic values of the Army, they've really done an effective job of smearing those values over into civil society. So when we do see prime ministers, it's hard to see whether their views are truly different from the military, or whether they act like they acquiesce to the military because they're afraid of a coup. But here's what we can observe, right? We really don't have a true civilian leader until Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, right? We know this. And he was the worst, right? Under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 1974, he began the Afghan Jihad. And there's a very long history. The Pakistani myth that the Americans sucked Pakistan into our jihad, it's really a myth. I can point you to loads of Pakistani sources on this. In 1974, we were really worried about Pakistan and India's nuclear proliferation. We didn't care about what was happening in Afghanistan. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, as I already mentioned, did some of the most pernicious things that turned the clock forward in terms of Pakistan's pervasive culture of intolerance. His daughter brought us the Taliban. She, in fact, brought all of her father's Taliban, well, they weren't Taliban at the time, but her father had a whole series of fellows, including Nasrullah Baba, who managed his Afghan policy and his jihad policy. So she brought all of these fellows back en suite, and she brought the Taliban. Though she herself is Shia, she went into political alliances with the anti-Shia SSP and the JUI, another anti-Shia political party, for no other purposes than cobbling together enough votes to be in power. And needless to say, her son continues to espouse this nonsense that Kashmir Pakistan banayega. And he says it in really bad Punjabi, which I think is kind of weird. And in fact, it was Zulfikar Bhutto Benazir, now her son, who continues to prattle on about this 10,000-year war over Kashmir when Pakistan had no entitlement to Kashmir to begin with. With respect to Nawaz Sharif, he's been very reticent to go after the sectarian groups because he doesn't want to alienate them as potential voters. So this is a very sad case where there's no heroes anywhere to be found. The political class as well as the military are all enablers of this pernicious thing that's eating up Pakistan. I want to point out to Pakistanis, more Pakistanis are dying because of their proxies than are dying in India. The only people that they're more likely to kill in larger numbers is Afghans. So this is a Pakistani problem that Pakistan needs to deal with. I want to turn, I think I understood the fellow's question about Balochistan, and this is an incredibly important question. I'm so happy that you raised it. I have a lot of data that looks at the changing views in Balochistan as a consequence of the state specifically supporting Islamist militant groups in Balochistan. Lashkar-e-Taiba, under the name of Jamaat al-Dawa and its philanthropic but similarly prescribed name FIF, they have been singularly allowed to do all of the humanitarian work in Balochistan to promote this message of Sunni extremism that the army likes to promote. They've also supported Lashkar-e-Jumbi to do the dirty work, and obviously JUI, and the consequences of that are important. Turning to the numbers, yes, we need numbers. It's not enough to just wave our hand and say, well, it looks pretty dodgy. Numbers are the only way we can look at things scientifically and try to understand what explains the trends that we observe. So if we're not going to do this scientifically, I should just go back to my PhD where I looked at, the Punjabi historical fiction. But I think I also heard you ask about other countries in the region. You asked about Bangladesh. Well, unfortunately, many of the things that we are seeing in Bangladesh is a stem. It has its historical roots in its creation and its original ties with Pakistan. Pakistan has been incredibly active in supporting Islamist militant groups in Bangladesh. I've spent a lot of time in Bangladesh. Huji, all of these groups there, Deobandi, they've long enjoyed Pakistani support. Pakistan has sent Lashkar-e-Taiba to Bangladesh. FIF is operating in Bangladesh. So many of the things that Bangladesh is experiencing is an admixture of things that are of a historical trajectory in its own, trying to figure out what does the two-nation theory, if anything, still mean for it? Does Bangladeshi mean being Muslim first or Bangladeshi first? Coupled with these activities in Pakistan. Sri Lanka, I heard you mention. Yes, Sri Lanka had an insurgency for many years, but what you're really missing is that at no point in time did the Sri Lankan government give support to the Tamil Tigers. The Indians did, very briefly, and they paid a big price for it. They lost a prime minister over it. So Pakistan is unlike other countries in the region because it is the creator of these terrorist groups, and it is the country which is most responsible for the spread of Islamist terrorism throughout the region. And obviously, Afghanistan has been one of the biggest victims of this pernicious disease. So I think Pakistan, even if you look in the region, is incredibly distinct. But yes, we need these numbers. We need these numbers terribly.
I'm sorry, we can't continue this anymore. We'll obviously go on for another 2 hours on this. Our next speaker is Mr. Irfan Hussain, who's a journalist and author who currently writes weekly columns for Dawn. He's been writing on a wide range of subjects for newspapers in Pakistan and elsewhere since 1970. He was had a 30-year career in the Pakistan Civil Service, during which he was an information minister in the Pakistan Embassy in Washington, a speechwriter in the Prime Minister's Secretariat, and many other government posts. He's written extensively on national, regional, and international affairs over the years.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Christina Fair. She's certainly given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. But I won't take up what she said in her paper, because I'm sure many in the audience probably will have other questions. Now, before I talk about the existentialist threat that terrorism poses to Pakistan and go into what my perceptions are and why it's happening, I wish there was a map of Pakistan to show you that why our military planners have used terrorism as a tool over the past several decades. If you look at the middle of Pakistan, you'll see that Pakistan's main arteries, transport arteries, the rail system, the roads, pass very close to the Indian border. And it's the Pakistan military's worst nightmare that India can cut this in a very quick armored thrust. So for many years, before 9/11 especially, Pakistan had a doctrine of strategic defense in which they thought that they could pull back into Afghanistan and continue the fight from there. After 9/11, this changed, and now Pakistan relies more and more on battlefield nuclear weapons to neutralize the threat of an Indian attack across the border. Now, this has its own problems, which I'll come back to in a little while. But at the same time, there's been a growing nexus, as viewed from the army headquarters, between Kabul and New Delhi. Just a couple of days ago, Prime Minister Modi has promised an aid package of $1 billion to Kabul. And now, obviously, Pakistan can't match this kind of money or buy this kind of influence. So what it's afraid of is that there will be a formal alliance between Afghanistan and India, and Pakistan will be encircled. Now, many years ago, I asked a Pakistani general how he could justify the use of Islamic militants in Kashmir. And his reply was quite revealing. He said, you know, we send over a few hundred militants, and that ties down several Indian Army divisions. So it's a win-win situation for us. Except, of course, it wasn't. It was a lose-lose situation because, as Dr. Fair mentioned, there's been massive blowback in Pakistan. Because when General Musharraf, under pressure from the Americans, tried to rein these people in, they turned their guns on Pakistan, on the Pakistani state, and targeted both soft civilian targets and as well as military and security agencies. So there's been about 60,000 dead so far in different kinds of militancy and different kinds of terrorism. Dr. Fair has detailed the different varieties of violence that has been wrecking Pakistan for decades now. And it started, the whole concept, I think, started way back in 1948, when during the brief war in Kashmir, Pakistan went into Kashmir and seized a large amount of territory before they stopped just short of Srinagar, and then the Indian government flew in troops. So, and which is where now the line of control falls. But that was the first use of irregulars which provided deniability to the state. The second time this happened was in 1971 during the terrible civil war in what was then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, when militants from the Jamaat-e-Islami were served as a sort of irregular arm to the Pakistan army and were guilty of many atrocities there. Then when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the late 70s, and the Americans and the Saudis joined this fight, and militants were used against the Soviet forces with American money and arms, and Muslim militants were flown in from around the world to the tribal areas of Pakistan and used to varying effects against the Soviets. And these people then couldn't go back to their countries, and they settled in the tribal areas where they married, raised families, and so on. So when the Soviets pulled back, Pakistan was left with about 3 million Afghan refugees and thousands of these fighters who had set up home there. Around the same time as the Soviets pulled back, there was an indigenous uprising in Kashmir. And the army tried to, or the defense establishment tried to take over this movement by infiltrating jihadi elements there. And there was, as you all know, there was a lot of fighting, a lot of bloodshed. So the army thought that if militant groups, motivated and trained, could defeat one of the strongest armies in the world, then this would surely be a good tool to have as an arsenal. But as we've seen, there has been massive consequences of this policy. So, and again, as Dr. Fair mentioned, there is a lot of support, not overt perhaps, but in TV chat shows, in classrooms, there is support for these, if not the violence these people unleash, at least for the kind of mindset they represent. And this has been absolutely poisonous for Pakistan. And so far, we've had a situation where, despite this terrible killing and violence, governments, both military and civilian, have been dragging their feet in tackling this problem. Right-wing leaders like Nawaz Sharif and Imran Khan have been urging talks which went nowhere. This has delayed armed response. But finally, when the Pakistani Taliban overreached themselves and attacked an army school in Peshawar in December 2014 and killed 130 students, children really, and This galvanized the army and knocked heads together, insisted that the Prime Minister call in all political parties, and there was a unanimous agreement on something called the National Action Plan, which had about 18 or 19 provisions, including obviously armed response to the terrorists, and also to change the curricula in schools, control the madrasas, at least register them, and change their teaching to more modern subjects and so forth, and to stop hate speech on the media as well in mosques and so on, a number of things. But while the army has launched its Operation Zarb-e-Azb in the tribal areas and gone to previously no-go zones, the civil, provincial and federal governments have been dragging their feet. And this, to most rational people, would seem incomprehensible, until you see that, as Dr. Fair again pointed out, that a lot of the support is in Punjab, where Imran Khan and Nawaz Sharif are locked in political battle because Punjab represents about 60% of Pakistan's population. So if somebody wins big in Punjab, they can effectively win the election. The last time Nawaz Sharif won it, and now Imran Khan is jockeying for position. So both of these politicians are right of center, and they don't want to alienate the support base that also holds up this Taliban mindset. So we've got a number of factors, political, social certainly, and then you've got a situation where Pakistan has probably one of the lowest conviction rates in the world. Only about 10% of accused killers are actually convicted. Often witnesses are frightened off, they don't want to come to court and identify themselves. Judges receive death threats, and of course the whole criminal investigation system is antiquated, the laws are relics of the British Raj, and so on. So there's no political will so far to actually change any of this and move forward. There's very little consensus as well. So these are the political dimensions, and then, as I mentioned earlier, there is a military dimension to it. The military sees the possible use of militants as a tool to counter India's preponderance. I mean, India is 5 times the size, it's a much bigger army, obviously, and so forth. So as long as these two things happen, the army is convinced that India presents an existential threat to Pakistan, and the politicians want to use the right-wing clerics, political parties, to shore up support for themselves. I fear nothing very much is going to change. And yet, the fact is that the world is not going to stand for for an indefinite continuation of this kind of policy. And I've opposed this in my columns over the years. I've written against using any kind of Islamic proxies to further our political agenda. But you have to understand where these people are coming from, why they take decisions, because they are not irrational actors. There are some very smart people there, and who their perception of the national interest is not mine, perhaps, but nevertheless, it is accepted widely in Pakistan. And perhaps I'm going a bit further than the paper calls for, but I think there has to be some kind of settlement between India and Pakistan, so there's more space for more liberal, more rational attitudes to develop. Currently, because there is this fear, and the army can always use this threat, there have been, as you know, several wars between the two countries. I won't go into who started and why they happened, but nevertheless, there is this attitude in Pakistan that India represents a threat, and to counter this threat, they require unconventional means. And as I said, I wish somehow there could be some settlement to this, but I frankly don't see it happening in my lifetime, at least, because there was a period of optimism at one time, but none of these efforts have come to anything. And from the sounds coming out of New Delhi currently, from the from this government, I fear nothing's going to change very much. So I think I'll stop it there, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Irfan. Bob Blackman is Conservative MP for Harrow East, has been since 2010. Many Pakistanis and Indians, I think, in your constituency. Perhaps relevant also to say that you've been a consistent Brexiteer.
Correct.
And I think I heard you in a meeting just before the referendum arguing that Brexit would be good for India.
Yes, absolutely correct.
Right. So we know where you stand. But on this question, you are going to talk about Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in Kashmir and the dangers of the China-Pakistan economic corridor for the Indian subcontinent.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You're absolutely right. I am a very strong...
Is that live?
Is this live? Is this working? Is it? A strong supporter of Britain regaining its freedom and negotiating trade relationships all over the world, and particularly with our great partners in the Commonwealth, with India and beyond. But that's not the subject that you asked me to speak about. I have had the opportunity of visiting Jammu and Kashmir and also the Punjab this year, and seeing at first hand the longest line of control anywhere in the world between Pakistan and India in the illegally occupied Pakistani quarter of Kashmir. And the reality is that what we've had, and I listened with great interest to what Christina said and our previous speaker, what we've had over the years has been a position whereby Pakistan or Pakistani concentrated efforts have infiltrated into the single state of Jammu and Kashmir on both sides of the line of control. It is, as I say, the longest line of control anywhere in the world, and indeed has the largest border force anywhere in the world in India to attempt to police. The reality is that under United Nations resolutions, the official position of the Indian government and beyond, the stated position, and quite clearly, is that the whole of Jammu and Kashmir is part of India and an integral part of India, and that's where we should be starting from. So the illegal occupation of any part of Kashmir by Pakistan should cease, and therefore the whole of the state retained within India, and then security can be maintained. The current position is, of course, that there is frequent, well-documented evidence of infiltration across the line of control into Kashmir and beyond, which creates the undercurrent of both of terrorists, and this is quite, and when we talk about rational people, these are deliberately rational people. These are not hotheads. These are people that see a political and religious purpose towards cleansing, ethnically cleansing the Kashmir Valley of anyone who is not a Muslim. And we should understand that that is precisely what has been intended from the word go. There have been the frequent attacks, state-sponsored attacks on India more broadly, both in the Punjab and beyond, and at each case they can be traced back to emanating from Pakistan. Now, whether that is supported by the Pakistani military, by the Pakistani government, what we do know is it stems from Pakistan, and Pakistan is therefore a state which is causes to India and to other parts of the world. Now, the reality is that we then have another danger that is encircling India, and that is the China-Pakistani economic corridor. Now, if you look at the map, and we could look at a map and that would see, what is happening is that China is building that economic link through Pakistan and encircling India. At the south of India, on Sri Lanka, China has developed an international airport and an international deep sea port. Their whole basis, both in the South China Sea and to the tip of India, is to control both the sea lanes of the world and the airways of the world. Their aim in China is quite clear, is the long-term encirclement of India, and you can see this going on in Africa as well. And the risk of that is that we have the risk to the largest democracy in the world, in India, being encircled by one of the most totalitarian states on the planet. I think that is a direct threat to democracy, is a direct threat to religious and fundamental freedoms. And I think that's a huge risk that we are undertaking. Now, quite clearly, the security of the region is such that we need to be sending messages both loud and clear that this whole attempt to encircle India is completely unacceptable. That certainly from I'm one of those that speak up very loudly to say Britain should be sending a strong signal to both China and to Pakistan that what is going on is unacceptable, and that we should be building our security and friendship with India on a strong military, security and democratic basis. And indeed that what we should be doing is making clear that what is happening is unacceptable, and equally signing up what I would call a greater security element across the world, with a security arrangement which would exist between the United States, the UK, Israel and India and Australia, so that we would then encircle the globe with a group of countries that value freedom and democracy above all else, and will cooperate on a security basis to protect one another from individual attacks. The reality is that where we sit in Europe at the moment, NATO has made us safe from attack from the east since the Second World War. But in the Far East, there is a real risk, I believe, to democracy and the freedoms that we would all associate. You can see that happening on a day-to-day basis. You can see the threat coming. I think, and this is my personal thoughts, this has suited Pakistan to have a position of the illegally occupied part of Kashmir as a buffer zone, and to keep India busy while it continues its progress in this way. To me, that's unacceptable, and we should send the strong signals that actually we will not stand for that. Mr. Chairman, I'll stop there and take, if there are any contributions or questions or counter views, I'm very happy to argue them and point out the historical basis of what I've been talking about.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Just a minute. Thank you very much. You certainly presented a very uncompromising presentation of the situation on Kashmir.